The Frozen Dragon. Story. Part 1. Margaret Chen had seen many things in her 73 years on Earth. 2 wars, 3 grandchildren, and countless winters in the mountains of Montana. But nothing had prepared her for what she found that bitter February morning when the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. She was checking her rabbit snares near the old copper mine, a routine she'd maintained since her husband died 5 years ago. The pension wasn't much, and fresh meat helped stretch her grocery budget. The snow crunched under her boots as she followed the familiar path through the pine trees, her breath forming crystals in the frigid air. The first snare was empty. So was the second. Margaret sighed and adjusted her wool scarf, preparing to check the third trap near the abandoned mine entrance. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind through the rocks. But something about it made her stop and listen. It came again, a weak, rhythmic tapping, like Morse code but slower. Margaret had been a radio operator in the Air Force back in the 60s, and her trained ear caught the pattern immediately. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS. "What the hell?" she muttered, following the sound toward the mine shaft. The entrance had been sealed with heavy metal plates decades ago, but time and weather had loosened the bolts. One plate had shifted, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The tapping was definitely coming from inside. Margaret pulled out her flashlight and called through the gap. "Hello? Is someone in there?" The tapping stopped, then started again, more urgent this time. Against every instinct telling her to go home and call the sheriff, Margaret began working at the loose metal plate. Years of ranch work had kept her strong, and the old bolts gave way easier than expected. She created an opening large enough to slip through, though every rational thought screamed that this was foolish. The mine tunnel stretched ahead, supported by rotting timber beams that groaned ominously. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing old rail tracks and rusted mining equipment. The air smelled of damp rock and something else, something metallic and strange. The tapping had stopped, but Margaret pressed forward. The tunnel curved to the right, opening into a larger chamber that had once been a work area. She swept her light across the space and froze. In the center of the chamber lay something impossible. It was roughly the size of a small horse, with scales that shifted from deep purple to black in the flashlight beam. 2 wings were folded against its sides, and a long neck ended in an angular head with closed eyes. Ice crystals covered its entire body, and its breathing was so shallow that Margaret initially thought it was dead. Then one golden eye opened and looked directly at her. Margaret's hand trembled, and the flashlight beam wavered. The creature, dragon, her mind supplied helplessly, tried to lift its head but managed only a few inches before exhaustion forced it back down. Its breathing was labored, each exhale creating a small puff of vapor in the frigid air. "Jesus Christ," Margaret whispered. Then, louder, "What are you?" The dragon's eye tracked her movements as she took a cautious step forward. There was intelligence there, unmistakable and profound. This wasn't some mindless animal. This was someone. Margaret had always been practical above all else. She'd raised 3 children through good times and bad, nursed her husband through cancer, and survived the kind of hardships that taught a person to focus on what needed doing rather than what couldn't be understood. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it was dying of cold and exhaustion. She knelt beside it, noting the way ice had formed in the spaces between its scales. The dragon was hypothermic, probably had been for days or weeks. How long had it been trapped down here? How had it even gotten into a sealed mine? "Easy there," she said softly. The same tone she'd used with injured animals over the years. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon made a sound, barely audible, part whimper, part whine. It tried to move again, but lacked the strength. Margaret shrugged off her heavy winter coat and laid it over the creature's torso. It wasn't nearly large enough to cover the whole body, but it was a start. The dragon's eye widened in what might have been surprise. "I'll be right back," she told it. "I need to get some things." The trip back to her cabin took 20 minutes of hard hiking through the snow. Margaret's mind raced the entire way. She should call someone, the authorities, the military, scientists. This was beyond anything she could handle alone. But who would believe her? And what would they do to the creature? Lock it up in some government facility? Experiment on it? The thought made her stomach turn. Margaret had never been one to overthink things. The dragon needed help, and she was the only one there to provide it. Everything else could be sorted out later. She loaded her ATV with everything she could think of: battery-powered heaters, blankets, a camping stove, soup, water, and her late husband's military surplus sleeping bags. The medical kit came too, though she doubted human first aid would be much use. The return trip was slower, the ATV struggling through the deeper snowdrifts. Margaret parked as close to the mine entrance as possible and began hauling supplies through the gap in the metal plating. The dragon hadn't moved, though both golden eyes were open now, watching her with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Margaret set up the battery heaters first, positioning them to warm the air around the creature without pointing them directly at its ice-covered scales. "Gradual warming," she explained as she worked, falling into the habit of talking to the dragon as she would any patient. "Too much heat too fast can cause shock." She spread the sleeping bags over her coat, creating layers of insulation. The dragon submitted to her ministrations without resistance, though she could feel tension in its muscles, ready to defend itself if necessary, but trusting her for now. The camping stove came next. Margaret filled a pot with water from her thermos and set it to boil. When it was ready, she soaked a cloth in the warm water and began carefully cleaning the ice from around the dragon's nostrils and mouth. The creature's breathing immediately became easier. It made another sound, this one clearly expressing gratitude. "You're welcome," Margaret said automatically, then felt foolish for talking to it like a person. But as she continued working, cleaning ice from the dragon's eyes and the delicate membrane of its wings, she couldn't shake the feeling that it understood every word, the way it positioned itself to make her job easier, the careful way it avoided moving too quickly and startling her. This was cooperation, not just animal instinct. After an hour of work, the dragon's core temperature had risen enough that it could lift its head without trembling. Margaret was preparing another pot of warm water when it spoke. "Thank you." The words were clearly articulated despite the creature's unusual vocal apparatus. Margaret dropped the pot, sending water splashing across the rocky floor. "You can talk," she said stupidly. "Yes." The dragon's voice was deep and musical, with undertones that seemed to resonate in Margaret's chest, though I was beginning to wonder if I would have the chance again. Margaret sat down heavily on a supply crate. "What are you? Where did you come from?" "My name is Zephyros. was a scout for the Draconic Dominion. Our ship was damaged in what you would call a wormhole accident. We crashed in your mountains 3 weeks ago." "We?" Pain flickered in the dragon's golden eyes. "I am the only survivor. The others died in the crash. I managed to crawl here seeking shelter, but the cold—" Zephyros's voice trailed off. "A spaceship?" Margaret's world view was reshaping itself by the minute. "You're an alien." "Yes, though that term seems inadequate. We are explorers, scientists. We came to study your star system, not to conquer or interfere. The accident was unfortunate." Margaret processed this information with the same practical approach she applied to everything else. Alien dragon in her mind, spaceship crash, 3 weeks of freezing temperatures. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Zephyros blinked in surprise. Yes." I have not eaten since the crash. Margaret pulled out a can of beef soup and began heating it on the camping stove. What do your people normally eat? We are omnivores, similar to humans in that regard, though our diet tends toward the carnivorous side. Soup's got meat in it. It's a start. As the soup warmed, Margaret found herself studying her unexpected patient more closely. Zephyros was magnificent, even weakened and injured. The scales caught the light from the heaters and seemed to shimmer with their own internal glow. The wings, now that she could see them properly, were architectural marvels, delicate bones supporting membranes that looked both strong and flexible. "How do you know English?" she asked. "Our translation matrices analyze communication patterns. I learned your language by listening to your radio transmissions during the approach to your planet." "That's impressive." "We are an old species, Margaret Chen. We have had time to develop sophisticated tools." Margaret started. "How do you know my name?" "The same way I learned your language. Radio transmissions carry much information. Your social security number was recently used for a transaction at Peterson's General Store in Silver Falls. The database query was transmitted over an unencrypted channel." Zephyros managed what might have been a smile. "Your people are remarkably trusting with your personal data." "Well, I'll be damned." Margaret stirred the soup thoughtfully. "So you know all about us?" "Some things. I know you are a former military communications specialist. You lost your husband to cancer. You have 3 children and 7 grandchildren, though you see them infrequently due to geographic distance. You supplement your pension income through hunting and a small garden. You are practical, intelligent, and uncommonly brave." "How do you figure that last part?" "You found an unknown alien life form in an abandoned mine and decided to bring it soup rather than call your military." Margaret chuckled. "When you put it that way, it does sound a little crazy." "Perhaps, but it may also be the beginning of something extraordinary." The soup was ready. Margaret had no idea how to feed a dragon, but Zephyros solved that problem by extending his neck toward the pot. She held it steady while he drank directly from the rim, careful not to spill. "Better?" she asked when he was finished. "Much. The warmth helps more than the nourishment, though both are welcome." "Can you move around yet?" Zephyros shifted experimentally, managing to lift his torso slightly. "Some. I will need time to recover fully. The cold did considerable damage, and I was injured in the crash as well." "What kind of injuries?" "Fractures in my left wing bone, torn flight membrane, some internal damage from the impact." Zephyros settled back down with obvious exhaustion. "Without medical treatment, I will heal eventually, but it will take months, perhaps longer." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "This mine isn't safe for a long-term recovery. Those support beams are rotted through, and if we get much more snow, the whole entrance could collapse." "I have nowhere else to go. My ship is destroyed beyond repair. Even if it were not, I lack the energy to reach it." "Where did it crash?" "Approximately 12 kilometers northeast of here, in what you call the Bitter Root Range." Margaret knew the area. Remote, practically inaccessible, except by helicopter or serious hiking. No wonder no one had found the crash site yet. "We need to get you somewhere warmer and safer," she said. "My cabin's not big enough, but there's an old barn on the property. It's weatherproof and has electricity." "You would take such a risk for a stranger?" "You're not exactly a stranger anymore. Besides, can't leave you here to freeze to death. Wouldn't be right." Zephyros studied her for a long moment. "Your species is remarkable, Margaret Chen. I begin to understand why the Dominion has been watching your people with such interest." "Watching us?" "For some time. Not interfering, merely observing. Humanity is unique among the species we have encountered." "How so?" "Most civilizations, when they achieve spaceflight, do so through collective effort and shared knowledge. Your people reach the stars while still fighting among yourselves. Most species develop unified planetary governments before venturing beyond their homeworld. Humans began exploring space while your planet was divided into hundreds of competing political entities. It should not work, yet somehow it does. Margaret considered this. Maybe we're just too stubborn to let logic stop us. Perhaps. Or perhaps you understand something that other species do not. Like what? That survival and growth require not just cooperation, but the willingness to act independently when cooperation fails. You found me here not because some authority told you to search, but because you chose to investigate an unusual sound. You are helping me not because it serves any larger purpose, but because it is the right thing to do in this moment. Most people would do the same, would they? In our observations, humans consistently demonstrate this pattern, individuals making decisions based on immediate moral imperatives rather than larger strategic considerations. It appears chaotic from the outside, but the results speak for themselves. You have achieved in a few centuries what takes most species millennia. Margaret packed up her supplies, leaving the heaters running. Well, we can discuss human nature later. Right now, we need to figure out how to get you to somewhere safe. Can you walk? Zephyros struggled to his feet, wings partially extended for balance. He managed a few steps before exhaustion forced him to rest. Short distances with frequent stops. The barn's about 2 kilometers from here. Think you can make it if we take our time? With your help, yes. Margaret looked at the dragon, her dragon. She found herself thinking and smiled. Then let's go home. The Frozen Dragon. Story, Part 2. The journey to Margaret's barn took 3 hours. Zephyros moved slowly but steadily, resting every 100 meters while Margaret scouted ahead and cleared obstacles from their path. The dragon's strength was returning gradually, and by the time they reached the old wooden structure, he could walk without assistance. Margaret had built the barn with her late husband 20 years ago, intending to raise horses. Life had taken different turns, and it had served mainly as storage ever since, but it was solid, insulated and equipped with electric heaters that she activated as soon as they arrived. "This will do nicely," Zephyros said, settling onto the hay-covered floor with obvious relief. Much better than the mine. Margaret spent the rest of the day making the space comfortable. She brought blankets, food, water, and a camp stove for cooking. More importantly, she brought her late husband's extensive collection of books, everything from technical manuals to science fiction novels. "Reading material," she explained, stacking the books within easy reach. "Figured you might get bored." Zephyros examined the volumes with interest. "Your written language is as fascinating as your spoken one. So many variations and exceptions to the rules." "English is a mongrel language. We steal words from everybody else and change the grammar whenever we feel like it. Perhaps that explains your species' adaptability." Over the following days, they settled into a routine. Margaret would arrive each morning with breakfast and supplies, check on Zephyros's healing progress, and spend several hours in conversation before returning to her cabin in the evening. The dragon proved to be endlessly curious about human culture, asking detailed questions about everything from farming techniques to political systems. "Your agricultural methods intrigue me," he said one morning, watching Margaret tend to seedlings she'd started in pots around the barn's sunny windows. "So much trial and error, so little standardization, yet you feed billions of people." "Good soil, good seed, good weather, and a lot of luck," Margaret replied, transplanting a tomato seedling. "Same as it's always been. But you modify the plants themselves now. Genetic manipulation to increase yields and resistance to disease." "Some folks do. I stick to the old varieties mostly. They taste better, even if they don't produce as much." Zephyros considered this. "In the Dominion, we have perfected agricultural science, Every crop is optimized for maximum nutritional value and yield. There is no waste, no uncertainty. Sounds efficient. It is. But we have lost something in the process. The taste you speak of, the variations that come from different soils and climates. Our food serves its purpose, but it lacks character. Margaret paused in her work. Is that why you came here? To study us? Partially. The Dominion Council believes humanity may have solutions to problems we did not know we had. Your chaotic methods somehow produce results that our organized approaches cannot match. What kind of problems? Zephyros was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. We are dying, Margaret, not as individuals, but as a species. We have achieved perfect efficiency, perfect order, perfect health. And in doing so, we have lost the ability to adapt, to grow, to surprise ourselves. Margaret set down her trowel and gave him her full attention. How do you mean? For the past 1,000 years, no dragon has created anything truly new. We maintain our technology, we explore new star systems, we catalog species and phenomena, but we do not innovate, we do not dream. We have become curators of our own civilization rather than builders of it. That sounds lonely. It is. We live for millennia, but our lives lack the vibrancy that yours possess. You humans burn bright and brief, creating beauty and chaos in equal measure. We envied that from a distance. And now? Now I begin to understand what we have lost. In 3 weeks with you, I have experienced more genuine surprise and discovery than in the past century of my life. Margaret resumed her planting, thinking, maybe that's what happens when you get too comfortable. Stop taking risks. Stop trying new things. Perhaps. But how does one choose to become uncomfortable again? How does a perfect system deliberately introduce imperfection? You don't. Systems don't change themselves. People do. Individual initiative again. Usually, someone has to be willing to mess things up a little. Zephyros chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. I suspect I have already begun that process. My unauthorized rescue by a human grandmother will cause considerable discussion among the council. Unauthorized? I was instructed to avoid contact with your species at all costs. The Dominion has strict protocols about interference with developing civilizations. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Developing? We've been to the moon. We've got space stations and robots on Mars. By our standards, you are still in your infancy. Most species do not achieve interstellar travel for several million years after developing spaceflight. You are accelerated. Maybe we're just impatient. Or perhaps you understand something about progress that we have forgotten. Their conversations continued in this vein for days. Margaret found herself looking forward to their talks more than anything else in her routine. Zephyros was healing rapidly, his fractures were mending, and he could now fly short distances around the barn. More importantly, his insights into human nature were making her see her own species in a new light. On the 10th day of his recovery, everything changed. Margaret arrived at the barn to find Zephyros standing at the window, wings partially extended in an unmistakable threat posture. His golden eyes were fixed on the sky to the northeast. "What is it?" she asked. "A Dominion search vessel. They have found me." Margaret followed his gaze and saw a metallic object descending through the clouds, too regular in shape to be natural. As it approached, details became visible. Sleek curves, no visible propulsion system, moving with impossible silence. "Are they here to rescue you?" Unknown. The Council's instructions were clear about avoiding contact. My survival may be seen as problematic. The ship landed in the meadow beyond the barn, with barely a whisper of displaced air. A section of its hull dissolved, revealing an opening large enough for several beings to exit. 3 dragons emerged, each larger than Zephyros and bearing elaborate markings that spoke of rank and authority. Margaret watched them approach with the same calm she'd shown when first encountering Zephyros. If 73 years had taught her anything, it was that panic never improved a situation. "Stay behind me," Zephyros said quietly. "Let me handle this." "Like hell. This is my property, and you're my guest. They want to talk to you. They go through me." Before Zephyros could protest, Margaret walked outside to meet the approaching delegation. The lead dragon was magnificent, scales like polished obsidian, wings that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes that held the weight of centuries. "I am Commander Thane of the Exploration Corps," the dragon said, its voice carrying clear authority. "I seek the one called Zephyros." "He's in the barn," Margaret replied evenly, "but he's still recovering from injuries. What do you want with him?" Commander Thane's eyes widened slightly. Apparently, he hadn't expected a human to speak so directly. "You are the one who provided aid to our lost scout." "I am. Name's Margaret Chen. And you are?" "Commander Thane, as I said." There was a pause, as if he wasn't sure how to continue. "I must ask that you stand aside while we retrieve our personnel." "Retrieve?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "He's not cargo. He's a person who was injured and needed help. You do not understand the complications your intervention has created. Then explain them." Zephyros emerged from the barn before Commander Thane could respond. "The complications, Margaret, are political. My survival and our contact violate several Dominion protocols." "Zephyros," Commander Thane's voice carried obvious relief. "You live. The Council will be pleased." "Will they? Or will they be concerned about contamination protocols and cultural interference guidelines?" "Your cynicism is noted. However, you will return with us immediately for debriefing and medical evaluation." "And Margaret? What happens to her?" Commander Thane glanced at Margaret with what might have been uncertainty. "The human will be processed according to standard protocols for unauthorized contact." "Processed how?" Margaret asked, not liking the sound of that. "Memory modification. The contact will be removed from your consciousness and replaced with an acceptable alternative explanation for recent events." "You mean brainwashing?" "We prefer the term selective editing. It is painless and leaves no lasting effects." Margaret looked at Commander Thane, then at Zephyros, then back at the commander. "No." "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. You're not messing with my head, and you're not taking Zephyros anywhere until he's fully healed and ready to go." "Human, you do not understand what you are refusing. The knowledge of our existence could destabilize your entire civilization." "Could it? Or would it just inconvenience yours?" Commander Thane drew himself up to his full, impressive height. "You dare to question Dominion policy?" "I dare to question anyone who wants to mess with my mind without permission." Margaret's voice carried the steel that had gotten her through military service and decades of hard living. "This is sovereign U.S. territory, and you don't have jurisdiction here. Your territorial claims are irrelevant to—" "Are they?" Zephyros interrupted. "Commander, have you reviewed recent updates to First Contact protocols?" "What updates?" "While I was recovering, I had considerable time to monitor human communication networks. Their legal and political systems are more sophisticated than our initial assessments indicated. More relevantly, they have nuclear weapons and a demonstrated willingness to use them when threatened." Commander Thane's expression shifted to one of concern. "Surely you don't suggest they would—" "I suggest that forcibly abducting one of their citizens and performing unauthorized medical procedures might be considered an act of war. Humans have fought wars over far less." Margaret watched this exchange with growing understanding. Zephyros was protecting her, but more than that, he was using the Dominion's own caution against them. Furthermore, Zephyros continued, Margaret Chen is not a random civilian. She is a military veteran with security clearances and connections to governmental intelligence agencies. Her disappearance would be investigated. This was news to Margaret, though she kept her expression neutral. Her clearance had expired decades ago, and her connections to intelligence agencies consisted mainly of occasional Christmas cards from old Air Force buddies. The Council will not appreciate these complications, Commander Thane said slowly. Then perhaps the Council should reconsider its approach, Zephyros replied. I have learned much during my time here. Humans may be more valuable as allies than as subjects for observation. Allies. One of the other dragons spoke for the first time. They are barely civilized by our standards. Are they? They achieved space flight while maintaining cultural diversity across hundreds of nations. They have survived nuclear weapons without destroying themselves. They show remarkable individual initiative and adaptability. These are not the characteristics of a primitive species. Margaret found herself oddly proud of Zephyros's defense of humanity, even if some of it was diplomatic exaggeration. The protocols exist for good reasons, Commander Thane said firmly. Premature contact has disrupted developing civilizations before, and rigid adherence to protocol has caused us to miss opportunities. When did we become so afraid of the unexpected? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret could see something shift in Commander Thane's expression, a flicker of the same dissatisfaction that Zephyros had described feeling about Dominion society. What do you propose? Commander Thane asked finally. Allow the contact to proceed naturally. Margaret has demonstrated trustworthiness and discretion. Use her as a test case for limited, controlled interaction. The Council would never approve such an experiment. Then don't ask them. Exercise field commander discretion. The protocols allow for judgment calls in unprecedented situations. Margaret decided it was time to rejoin the conversation. What exactly are you proposing? Zephyros looked at her with something that might have been hope. A cultural exchange program, informal, limited in scope, but genuine. I continue my recovery here while documenting human adaptive techniques. You serve as a liaison, learning about Dominion science and culture. We prove that contact can be beneficial rather than disruptive. And if your council disagrees? Then we deal with that when it happens. But at least we will have demonstrated an alternative to the current approach. Commander Thane was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing options. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of decision. I will grant you 1 month. If this experiment shows positive results, I will recommend policy review to the Council. If it creates problems, he let the threat hang unfinished. Understood, Zephyros replied. And you, human Margaret Chen, you understand that sharing knowledge of our existence with others would force our hand? Margaret nodded. I understand. But I also understand that some secrets are too important not to share eventually. Perhaps, but not yet. The dragons returned to their ship, leaving Margaret and Zephyros alone in the meadow as the vessel disappeared into the sky. Well, Margaret said after a moment, that was interesting. Indeed. Though I fear we have merely postponed the difficult decisions rather than resolved them. Maybe. But sometimes postponement is all you need. Things change, people change their minds, new possibilities emerge. Zephyros looked at her with what was clearly admiration. You continue to surprise me, Margaret Chen. Good. If I'm going to be representing humanity in your cultural exchange program, I'd better keep you on your toes. I believe, Zephyros said with something approaching a smile, that this is going to be the most interesting month of my very long life. The Frozen Dragon. Story. Part 3. 3 weeks into their cultural exchange, Margaret discovered that teaching an alien dragon to appreciate human coffee was surprisingly similar to teaching her grandchildren to ride bicycles. It required patience, enthusiasm, and the willingness to clean up considerable messes. "The bitterness is intentional," Zephyros asked, examining the steaming mug with scientific fascination. "That's the point. We don't just drink it for the caffeine, though that helps. There's ritual to it, comfort, social connection. My husband and I used to sit on the porch every morning with our coffee, planning the day. Ah, it serves a ceremonial function as well as a nutritional one. Everything humans do serves more than one function. That's what you folks don't seem to get." Zephyros had grown stronger over the past weeks, his injured wing now fully functional and his energy restored. More importantly, he had become genuinely excited about human culture in a way that surprised them both. The barn had been transformed into an improvised laboratory where he documented everything from Margaret's garden techniques to her grandmother's recipes. "Your agricultural methods continue to fascinate me," he said, reviewing his notes while Margaret tended to the expanding garden she'd planted around the barn. "You plant multiple species in the same space, despite the fact that they compete for resources." "Companion planting. Some plants help each other. Tomatoes and basil, corn and beans, carrots and onions. They share nutrients, repel each other's pests, provide structure. But the yields are lower than monoculture farming." "Short term, maybe. Long term, the soil stays healthier, the plants are more resistant to disease and pests, and you get variety in your diet." Margaret straightened up from her weeding. "Everything's connected. Change one thing, everything else changes too. Complexity theory. Common sense." Zephyros made another note. In the weeks since Commander Thane's departure, he had filled dozens of notebooks with observations about human behavior, technology, and philosophy. The picture emerging challenged many of the Dominion's assumptions about developing civilizations. "I have been thinking about our conversation regarding innovation," he said. "I believe I understand now why the Dominion has stagnated." Margaret settled onto the barn's front steps, accepting the cup of coffee Zephyros had learned to prepare using his precise temperature control. "Oh? We perfected our systems too completely. Every problem has an established solution, every question a predetermined answer. There is no room for experimentation, because experimentation implies that our current methods might be improved. Pride goes before a fall." "Indeed. But humans never allow yourselves to believe you have found perfect solutions. You question everything, constantly. Sometimes to a fault, perhaps. But the alternative is worse. We have spent millennia proving ourselves right instead of growing." Their philosophical discussions had become a daily routine, often lasting hours as they explored the differences between their species. Margaret found herself thinking about humanity in ways she never had before, seeing her own people through an alien perspective that was both humbling and empowering. Today's conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of an approaching aircraft, but instead of the silent Dominion vessel, this was clearly human technology, the distinctive whop of helicopter rotors echoing off the mountain peaks. "Expecting visitors?" Zephyros asked, already moving toward the barn's back entrance. "No." Margaret watched the helicopter circle once before landing in the same meadow where Commander Thane's ship had touched down. "Military markings. This could be a problem." 4 people exited the aircraft, 3 in military uniforms and 1 in civilian clothes. Margaret recognized the type immediately. Intelligence operatives trying to look casual and failing. "Stay hidden unless I signal otherwise," she told Zephyros. "Let me handle this." The group approached with the careful confidence of people accustomed to getting answers. The civilian, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took the lead. "Mrs. Chen?" I'm Dr. Sarah Collins, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss some unusual activity in this area. What kind of activity? Margaret kept her voice neutral, falling back on old military habits. Electromagnetic anomalies, atmospheric disturbances, and some very interesting satellite imagery from 3 weeks ago. Dr. Collins's gaze swept the area with professional thoroughness. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Ask away. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Strange lights, unexplained sounds, aircraft that don't match known designs? Margaret considered her options. Lying to federal agents was generally inadvisable, but telling the complete truth seemed worse. Fortunately, decades of marriage had taught her the value of selective honesty. I saw some strange lights a few weeks back. Figured it was a meteor or space junk burning up. When exactly? 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Hard to remember exactly. And you didn't report it? Report what? Space rocks fall down all the time out here. Usually nothing left to find. Dr. Collins nodded, making notes. Any other unusual occurrences? Equipment malfunctions? Interference with radio or television reception? My radio's been acting up, but that old thing breaks if you look at it wrong. One of the military officers stepped forward. Ma'am, we have satellite data showing an unidentified object landing in this vicinity. The signature doesn't match any known aircraft. Margaret shrugged. If something landed around here, I'd have seen it. Nothing but trees and rocks for miles in any direction. What about that barn? Dr. Collins indicated the structure behind Margaret. Mind if we take a look? This was the moment Margaret had been dreading, but refusing would only make them more suspicious. Help yourself. Fair warning, though, it's full of junk. Been meaning to clean it out for years. The group moved toward the barn while Margaret followed, her mind racing. Zephyros was intelligent and had excellent hearing. Hopefully, he'd had enough warning to make himself scarce. Dr. Collins opened the barn door and stepped inside, followed by the others. Margaret held her breath as they examined the space, noting the comfortable setup she'd created, but apparently not finding anything suspicious. You've been spending time out here, observed one of the officers. Started a garden project. Easier to keep tools and supplies here than haul them back and forth from the house. They spent 10 minutes searching the barn thoroughly, finding nothing more threatening than gardening supplies and camping equipment. Margaret began to relax. Then Dr. Collins picked up one of Zephyros's notebooks. Interesting reading material, she said, flipping through pages covered with detailed observations about human agriculture, social behavior, and technological development. Very scientific approach to gardening. I like to be thorough. Dr. Collins read a few more pages, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. These notes are remarkably sophisticated. Advanced knowledge of biochemistry, materials science, social psychology. This is graduate-level analysis. I read a lot. Mrs. Chen, according to our records, you completed high school and some college-level correspondence courses in electronics. This work suggests someone with multiple advanced degrees. Margaret felt sweat forming despite the cool air. Maybe I'm smarter than your records indicate. Perhaps. Dr. Collins closed the notebook but kept it in her hands. Or perhaps you've had help with this analysis. From who? I live alone. That's what we'd like to determine. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Margaret was trying to think of a plausible explanation when she heard a sound from outside, the distinctive whistle of something large moving through the air at high speed. Dr. Collins and her team heard it too. They rushed outside just as a massive shadow passed overhead, too fast and too large to be any conventional aircraft. Jesus Christ, one of the officers muttered, raising his weapon instinctively. The shadow circled back, moving lower this time. Margaret could see Zephyros clearly now, wings spread wide as he performed what could only be described as an aerial display, loops, rolls, and complex maneuvers that demonstrated both incredible grace and obvious intelligence. "Hostile aircraft!" one of the officers shouted into his radio. "Request immediate backup!" "Wait," Dr. Collins said, watching Zephyros's performance with growing fascination. "Look at the flight pattern. That's not attack behavior." Zephyros completed his display by landing gently in the meadow, folding his wings and sitting in a posture that managed to be both dignified and non-threatening. He waited patiently for the humans to approach. Margaret made a command decision. "Dr. Collins, meet Zephyros. Zephyros, these are the people I told you might show up eventually." "You can communicate with it?" Dr. Collins asked, not lowering her weapon but not pointing it directly at Zephyros either. "With him," Margaret corrected. "And yes, he speaks better English than most humans." "Good afternoon," Zephyros said, inclining his head politely. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I felt the situation required clarification." The effect on Dr. Collins and her team was immediate and profound. Weapons were forgotten as scientific excitement took over. "My God," Dr. Collins whispered. "You're actually talking. You're intelligent." "Indeed. I am Zephyros of the Draconic Dominion, currently assigned to cultural observation duties on your planet." Cultural observation? The military implications hit Dr. Bang Collins immediately. "You're studying us?" "With Mrs. Chen's invaluable assistance, yes. Though studying implies a detachment that does not accurately describe our interactions." Margaret stepped forward. "Before we go any further, I need to know what your intentions are. Are you here to arrest me, him, or both of us?" Dr. Collins holstered her weapon and gestured for her team to do the same. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. This is so far outside normal protocols that I'm not even sure what our options are." "What do you mean?" "First contact with an intelligent alien species is supposed to happen at the highest levels of government, with months of preparation and international cooperation. It's not supposed to involve a retired Air Force sergeant rescuing a dragon from a mine shaft." "Sometimes reality doesn't follow the plan," Margaret said. "Clearly." Dr. Collins looked at Zephyros with a mixture of awe and professional assessment. "Can you tell us about your people, your technology, your intentions regarding Earth?" "Those are complex questions with complex answers. Perhaps we should begin with simpler matters." "Such as? Would you care for some coffee? Margaret has been teaching me about its cultural significance." An hour later, they were all seated in Margaret's cabin while Zephyros prepared coffee with the precision of a chemist and the enthusiasm of a convert. Dr. Collins had put away her recording equipment after Zephyros politely but firmly declined to be documented until certain diplomatic protocols were established. "Let me understand this correctly," Dr. Collins said. "Your people have been observing us for decades, but this is the first actual contact?" "Correct. The Dominion has strict non-interference policies. My presence here is irregular." "And your government doesn't know about this contact?" "They are aware but have granted me limited autonomy to conduct an experimental exchange program." Dr. Collins looked at Margaret. "And you've been doing what, exactly?" "Teaching him about human nature," Margaret replied. "Gardening, cooking, social customs, why we do things the way we do." "In exchange for?" "Learning about his people, their technology, their history, their perspectives on humanity." "This is completely unprecedented," one of the military officers said. "We need to contact Washington immediately." "Actually," Zephyros interjected, "I believe that would be premature." "Why?" "Because formal contact between governments would follow established diplomatic protocols that assume roughly equal technological and social development. The reality is more complex." Dr. Collins leaned forward. "How so?" "Your species possesses capabilities that mine has lost. Individual initiative, adaptive thinking, creative problem-solving. Meanwhile, We have technologies and perspectives that could benefit your development. But combining these advantages requires careful integration, not formal treaties between incompatible governmental systems. "What are you proposing?" Margaret answered before Zephyros could speak. "A trial run. Prove that the exchange works on a small scale before trying to expand it. Using you as test subjects? Using us as pioneers? Someone has to be first." Dr. Collins was quiet for several minutes, clearly working through implications and possibilities. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a significant decision. "I'm going to make a recommendation that will probably end my career," she said. "But I think you're right. This is too important to rush and too valuable to stop." "What kind of recommendation?" "Classified research project. Small team, limited scope, maximum security. We study the exchange process while keeping it contained. If it works, we gradually expand the program. If it creates problems, we have multiple fallback positions." Zephyros tilted his head thoughtfully. "And Margaret's status in this arrangement?" "Civilian consultant with appropriate clearance and compensation. Officially, she's helping us understand certain aspects of unconventional problem-solving." "And if your superiors disagree?" Dr. Collins smiled grimly. "Then I'll be looking for a new job. But I don't think they will. The potential benefits of this collaboration are too significant to ignore." "What about Zephyros's people?" Margaret asked. "They're expecting reports." "I will document our progress and recommend expansion of the program," Zephyros said. "The results so far have exceeded all expectations." "In what way?" "I have learned more about adaptive thinking in 1 month with Margaret than in decades of observation. Meanwhile, she has demonstrated that humans can integrate alien concepts without losing their essential humanity. This suggests that large-scale cultural exchange is not only possible but beneficial." Dr. Collins nodded slowly. "Then we have the framework for moving forward. Mrs. Chen, are you willing to become humanity's first official alien cultural liaison?" Margaret looked at Zephyros, who gave her an encouraging nod, then back at Dr. Collins. "Will I still be able to live here? Keep my garden?" "Absolutely. In fact, we'll probably want to expand your facilities to accommodate the research requirements." "And Zephyros?" "Will be our first official alien cultural ambassador, assuming his people approve the arrangement." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where this all began a month ago. She thought about her quiet retirement, her simple routines, her peaceful life that had suddenly become anything but simple or peaceful. She also thought about Zephyros's descriptions of his stagnant civilization, about humanity's unique gifts and troubling flaws, about the possibility of creating something unprecedented in the history of both species. "When do we start?" she asked. "We already have," Zephyros replied. "Everything else is just making it official." 6 months later, Margaret stood in the expanded barn that had become the headquarters for Project Integration, the most classified and most successful first contact program in human history. Around her, a team of carefully selected scientists, diplomats, and military personnel worked alongside 3 dragons who had volunteered for extended cultural exchange. The program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Human creativity and adaptability combined with Dominion knowledge and technology were producing innovations that neither species could have achieved alone. More importantly, both civilizations were rediscovering aspects of themselves they had forgotten or never knew they possessed. Margaret's role had evolved from accidental rescuer to something unprecedented, the first human to be granted honorary status in the draconic Dominion, while simultaneously serving as special advisor on xenological affairs for the Department of Defense. It was probably the strangest job title in government history. "The integration protocols are working better than anticipated," reported Dr. Martinez, the project's lead scientist. We've successfully adapted Dominion materials technology for terrestrial applications, while our problem-solving methodologies have helped them overcome 3 theoretical barriers that had stymied their researchers for centuries. Cultural adaptation? Margaret asked. Remarkable. The dragons have not only learned to appreciate human coffee, but Zephyros has become genuinely enthusiastic about baseball. Meanwhile, our team members have developed an appreciation for Dominion philosophy that's changing their approaches to long-term planning. Margaret smiled, remembering her early conversations with Zephyros about the differences between their species. It seemed those differences were becoming strengths rather than obstacles. Any problems? Minor ones. Commander Thane's latest report indicates some resistance from conservative factions in the Dominion Council. They're concerned about cultural contamination. And on our side? Congressional Oversight Committee is asking increasingly detailed questions about budget allocations. They can't understand why we need funding for gardens and kitchen facilities in a technology research program. Because they don't understand what we're really doing here, Zephyros said, approaching from across the barn where he'd been working with a team developing improved agricultural techniques. We are not just exchanging technologies. We are learning to think in new ways. The hardest thing to explain to bureaucrats, Margaret agreed. Perhaps that is because bureaucrats are selected for their ability to maintain existing systems rather than create new ones, suggested Kalia, one of the newer dragon researchers. Don't be too hard on them, Margaret said. Change is scary, especially when you're responsible for making decisions that affect millions of people. True, Zephyros acknowledged, but fear of change is how civilizations stagnate. Sometimes progress requires accepting uncertainty. Margaret looked around the barn at the mixture of human and dragon researchers working together, sharing ideas and perspectives that were creating possibilities neither species had imagined alone. It was messy, sometimes chaotic, often unpredictable. It was also miraculous. You know, she said to Zephyros, when I found you in that mine, I thought I was just helping an injured animal. And I thought I was simply trying to survive until rescue arrived. Funny how things work out. Not funny, Zephyros corrected with the closest thing to a grin his draconic features could manage. Perfectly human. You saw a problem and solved it without overthinking the consequences. And look where it got us. Indeed, perhaps that is humanity's greatest gift. The willingness to act on immediate moral imperatives without calculating all possible outcomes. Margaret nodded. Watching a young human engineer explain probability theory to an ancient dragon philosopher while they collaborated on a project that might revolutionize interstellar communication. Sometimes, she said, the best way to figure out what's possible is to start before you know what you're doing. A very human approach. Maybe, but it's working for both of us now. Outside the barn, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on the mountains where an old woman had once discovered a frozen dragon and changed the course of 2 civilizations. Inside, the future was being built one conversation, one collaboration, one impossible possibility at a time. It wasn't the future anyone had planned. It was better.